Hi folks, today we're going to talk about something everyone who's been through a harsh winter has wondered. How on earth did medieval peasants manage to survive the cold without freezing to death? Imagine living in a time with no central heating, no goose-down coats, no Netflix to distract you from the suffering, and still waking up every day to work the frozen ground. So before we warm up with this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's with us, especially if you're somewhere cozy right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and imagine you're in a medieval hut listening to the wind howling outside. Because today we're going to find out that surviving the medieval winter was a science. A cold science, literally. If you think complaining about a broken AC is dramatic, wait till you hear about January of 1205. Let's start with the obvious. It was cold as hell. The Middle Ages had the luck, and by luck, I mean total misfortune, of coinciding with the Little Ice Age. Modern climatologists, comfortably warmed in their labs, call this a period between the 14th and 19th centuries when global temperatures dropped by a few degrees. A few degrees. As if it were just a matter of swapping a sweatshirt for a coat. Luxury, thy name is thermostat. For a medieval peasant, 2 degrees less was the difference between "my God, it's cold" and "my God, where are my toes?" It was as if nature had decided to test how far humanity could go in the category of resisting the deep freeze without turning into an ice statue. Winters were so absurdly harsh that entire rivers became highways of ice. The Thames in London froze so solid that people held fairs on top of it. That's right, a medieval flea market. Walking on water, Christian edition. Picture the conversation. "Hi, where's the cheese stall?" Head down the bank, step onto the river, go straight until where there should be fish swimming. In 1234, the Danube turned into a natural bridge for 3 months straight. 3 months. People walked from Austria to Hungary across what would normally be a roaring river. Nature basically said, you know what? Bridges are overrated anyway. But the winter of 1407-1408 was the peak of climatic tomfoolery. Chronicles, written by guys who clearly had a sense of humor, report that wine froze in the barrels and had to be sold in pieces. Pieces of wine. Imagine the scene at the tavern. A glass of your best red. Please? Sure, here's your cube. Would you like a hammer to break it up or prefer to lick it like a popsicle? Medieval sophistication, ladies and gentlemen. And the worst part? Peasants couldn't just wrap themselves in a blanket and wait for the icy apocalypse to pass. There was no Netflix, no hot food delivery, and no option to work from home in a heated hut. They turned into human onions, layer upon layer of dirty cloth, and went out every single day to work soil that was harder than concrete. They cared for animals that were probably questioning their evolutionary choices. They fetched firewood in forests where even the trees seemed to be shivering. And you know what's most impressive? They not only survived, they did it without complaining on Twitter. The secret wasn't magic. It was pure human stubbornness, seasoned with techniques that would make a modern engineer cry tears of joy or despair, depending on the point of view. Because nothing says hardcore survival like turning a mud hut into a medieval sauna using only straw, animal manure, and a whole lot of desperate creativity. Now let's talk about the true masterpiece of medieval engineering, the peasant's house. And by masterpiece I mean a structure that would make a modern civil engineer question their faith in humanity and possibly consider a new career. Imagine a hut made of mud, sticks, and hope. Walls that were basically a mix of clay, chopped straw, and cow dung. Yes, cow poop was premium building material at the time. Medieval sustainability. Nothing is wasted, everything freezes, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The process of building those walls was an art in itself. Peasants took local clay, sometimes dug in the middle of winter with the ground hard as stone, and mixed it with straw cut to specific lengths. Not just any straw, it had to be the right size to create structural strength without breaking the cohesion of the mass. And the manure? You didn't just throw any old manure in. Cow dung was preferred because it had the right fibers and ideal consistency when dry. Horse manure was too loose. Sheep manure too granular. There was a whole scatological science behind medieval construction. Luxury, thy name is thermal insulation. The roof was another tale of desperate genius. Thatch, yes, but not just any thatch tossed any which way. The straw had to be harvested at the right time, not too green, not too dry, and then interlaced in specific layers. They started at the edges and worked upward in overlapping courses, like the scales of a giant fish. The end result? The whole house looked like a nest, where a very confused bird with coordination issues had decided to settle. But that thatch created an insulating layer up to 30 centimeters thick that kept heat in and the icy apocalypse out. The brilliance was in the architectural design. Houses were built semi-underground, half the structure below ground level. Why? Because any illiterate peasant knew the earth, about a meter down, maintains a fairly constant temperature year-round. It was basic physics applied by people who'd never heard of physics. They dug first, built later. The result was a house naturally sheltered from cutting winter winds and able to borrow the Earth's natural geothermal warmth. It was like living in a hobbit hole, minus the romantic part, with much more cold, and with a smell that definitely doesn't show up in the movies. The floor was another marvel of medieval practicality. Beaten earth mixed with straw and, guess what? More manure. Everything in the medieval home involved manure somehow. If there had been a home makeover show back then, it would have been Extreme Makeover Manure Edition, sponsored by the local Cattle Breeders Association. But the floor had its logic. Properly compacted, the mixture created a relatively smooth, water-resistant surface. More importantly, it retained heat. During the day, it absorbed whatever warmth it could catch. At night, it released that heat slowly, functioning like a rudimentary radiant heating system. Here's the most ingenious trick. Those houses were purposely tiny. We're talking structures 4 by 4 meters, sometimes 5 by 5 if the family was rich. Just one room. One room. For everything. Cooking, eating, sleeping, storing tools, drying clothes, making babies, caring for the sick. Everything happened in the same 16 square meters. For perspective, a modern studio apartment is luxury by comparison. Why so small? Basic physics. The smaller the air volume, the easier it is to heat with body warmth. Each person in a medieval home was basically a mini human fireplace at a constant 37 degrees, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 people in a 16 square meter house generated enough heat to keep indoor temperatures several degrees above the outdoors. It was like living inside a human oven. Literally. An entire family slept together in an area that would today be considered a generously sized closet. Parents, kids, grandparents, uncles, cousins. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. No separate bedrooms, no my personal space, no bathroom door because there was no bathroom. And sometimes, when the cold was particularly murderous, smaller animals slept indoors as well. Chickens, small pigs, young goats. Anything that generated heat and could fit through the door. Privacy. Thy name is bourgeois luxury. Picture it. You, your spouse, your 3 kids, your mother-in-law, and a goat named Brunhild, all sharing the same space for 4 months of winter. If that doesn't test a marriage, nothing will. Windows were practically non-existent. When they existed, they were tiny openings covered with thick cloth, or if the family was very lucky, with dried animal bladder that let a bit of light through. Glass? Glass was for churches and the very, very rich. The logic was simple. Window, heat loss. Every opening in the wall was an invitation for cold in and heat out. So they lived in constant penumbra during winter, lit only by the central fire and candles made from animal fat. It was like living in a cave, only a cave carefully engineered to keep you alive. The result of all this engineering by desperation? Houses that could maintain indoor temperatures 10 to 15 degrees above the outside. Not warm, but the difference between very cold and death by hypothermia. If you think living in a studio is cramped, imagine sharing 16 square meters with your entire family and occasionally the household livestock. At the center of every medieval peasant home, there was something sacred, revered, guarded more jealously than any treasure: the central fire. And when I say sacred, I'm not exaggerating. That hearth was literally the difference between waking up the next day or turning into a decorative ice figurine. The fire sat in the middle of the single room, in a circular area of stones or fired clay bricks called the hearth, the heart of the house. No chimney, no fancy ducts, nothing resembling a modern ventilation system. Smoke rose straight into the thatch and escaped through natural gaps in the roof. Result? The whole house lived in a constant haze. Medieval peasants basically lived inside a giant barbecue pit, breathing smoke all the time. If you think São Paulo traffic has polluted air, try spending a winter in a medieval house. But here's the clever bit: that smoke had unexpected side benefits. First, it killed insects and worms that could infest the thatch. Second, it worked as a natural preservative for meats and cheeses hung from the beams. Third, it created an extra insulating layer on the ceiling. They discovered that smoking the house was like treating it with pesticide, preservative, and insulation at the same time. Medieval multitasking: one problem, multiple solutions. Keeping the fire burning was a collective obsession. Someone in the family had to keep watch at night, feeding the embers with small sticks. If the fire died completely, relighting it was complicated and time-consuming. No matches, no lighters, no "give me a sec, I'll spark it up." The common method was using flint, striking a piece of flint against steel to produce sparks that would ignite tinder, usually dried fungus, very fine straw, or charcloth. On very damp or windy days, this could take hours. Hours to light a fire. Imagine waking up on a January morning, with temperatures around zero outside, and discovering the fire died overnight. Now you have to spend 2 hours striking steel with a rock, fingers freezing, trying to coax a spark that might, with luck, catch your slightly damp tinder. So some families developed a relay system. On the coldest nights, someone woke every 2 hours to add wood. It was like having a newborn, except instead of changing diapers, you changed kindling. Firewood was another epic drama. You couldn't just chop any tree and be done. Different woods burned differently. Oak burned slow and lasted longer, but was hard to cut. Pine caught easily but burned too fast. Birch was excellent for starting, but you needed a lot. Peasants developed an entire science of firewood. They knew green wood produced more smoke and less heat. That overly dry wood burned too quickly. That thin branches stoked the fire, while thick logs kept embers alive through the night. They cut wood in autumn and left it to dry under cover for months. Each family needed to stock the equivalent of several whole trees to get through winter. And that was assuming they had the feudal lord's permission to cut wood, because forests didn't belong to no one. They belonged to whoever ruled the region. Sometimes whole families spent weeks in autumn doing nothing but cutting, hauling, and stacking wood. It was like preparing for a war where the enemy was winter and the ammunition was dry timber. But the fire wasn't just for heat. It was the absolute center of domestic life. All cooking happened there. No stove, no separate oven, no microwave for leftovers. Everything was prepared in iron pots hung over the flames or on stones heated beside the embers. Breakfast? Oat porridge cooked in the pot over the fire. Lunch? Vegetable soup and, with luck, some meat in the same pot. Dinner? More soup, maybe with bread baked on hot stones by the hearth. Medieval culinary variety: hot soup, warm soup, and occasionally soup with unidentified floaty bits. In winter, the fire was always cooking something. There was always a pot of water boiling, either for cooking or to have hot water ready to clean wounds, wash hands, or prepare herbal teas that passed for medicine. The steam from that constantly boiling water helped humidify dry winter air and made things feel slightly more comfortable. It was like having a medieval humidifier running 24/7. At night, when it was time to sleep, they didn't just put out the fire and head to bed. That would be thermal suicide. Instead, they banked the embers with ash so they'd burn slowly all night, releasing steady heat without big flames. It was a delicate technique. Too much ash and the fire died. Too little and you wasted wood in a fast burn. Experienced peasants could judge exactly how much ash would keep embers alive for 8 hours. Waking to find embers still glowing under the ash was like winning the medieval lottery. It meant you could rekindle quickly, cook breakfast without drama, and start the day without 2 hours of flint striking. And during blizzards or brutal winds, when going out for more wood was impossible, that's where obsessive planning came in. Smart families always kept a reserve of dry kindling indoors, stacked against a wall, far enough from the fire not to spark accidentally, but close enough to grab at any moment. Because nothing tests family unity like realizing you've got wood for only 3 more days, and the blizzard outside shows no sign of stopping. Now we get to the most creative part of medieval survival: how to turn your body into a portable greenhouse using only rags, animal fat, and an absurd number of clothing layers. Medieval peasants invented layering 500 years before modern winter sports people discovered that many thin layers beat one thick one. The difference is they didn't have technical fabrics, no zippers, and definitely no option to buy a new jacket if the current one wasn't cutting it. A peasant's winter wardrobe was basically this: everything you own worn at the same time, plus a few borrowed things, plus some cloth you found in the barn and decided would count as clothing if tied in the right place. The first layer was always linen, when linen was available. A simple tunic, usually made at home during the summer months, when the women in the family had free time between harvests. Linen had the advantage of absorbing body moisture and drying relatively quickly. The downside is a linen tunic offers about as much thermal insulation as a shower curtain. Over the linen came wool. Wool, the miracle material of the Middle Ages. Sheep were basically walking thermal insulation factories that, conveniently, also produced milk and eventually meat. Like a multifunction appliance that feeds itself and reproduces. But getting quality wool was another epic saga. First, you needed to have sheep, or access to sheep, or money to buy wool from someone who had sheep. Second, the wool had to be shorn, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven. Third, all this had to happen in the warmer months, because in winter you were too busy not freezing to death. The process was so laborious that many families literally wore the same clothes for years. The same tunic, the same cloak, the same brays, which were like medieval underpants, more like loose pajama trousers. Imagine wearing the same outfit for 3 years straight. Now imagine doing that while working the land, tending animals, chopping wood, and living in a smoke-filled house. The concept of clean clothes was more aspirational than practical. Over the wool came the cloak, a rectangular piece of thick fabric that functioned as coat, blanket, improvised tent, and occasionally a sheet. Fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or simply tied, its versatility was impressive. By day, you wore it as a coat. Traveling, it became a blanket. Sleeping rough, it was your tent. If you had to carry things, it became an improvised sack. If someone got hurt, it was an emergency bandage. It was the Swiss Army knife of medieval textiles. Here's where it gets interesting. Peasants discovered that air trapped between layers acts as insulation. So they didn't just wear many layers. They wore many loose layers, creating pockets of air warmed by the body. The resulting silhouette was peculiar. A fully winter-dressed medieval peasant looked like a human snowman made of tied rags and smelling of wet sheep. For feet, things got even more creative. Leather shoes were expensive and hard to make. Most peasants wore something called poulains, basically pieces of leather tied around the feet with cords. Imagine a flat sandal made of thick leather with zero aesthetic pretension. For extra protection, they stuffed the poulains with dry straw, moss, or leaves, like wearing natural insulation socks. The problem is wet straw is worse than no straw, so they had to swap out the filling regularly. On the coldest days, some wrapped feet in thick cloth before putting on the poulains. Others tied animal pelts directly to their legs. The visual was like wearing furry boots minus the boots, and plus a lot more improvisation. For hands, the solution was even more ingenious. Gloves were a luxury. Worked leather required specialized skill few possessed. So they invented medieval mittens, fabric or leather sacks covering all the fingers together, keeping them warm through shared heat. But mittens don't work when you need your hands to work. So they developed a hybrid. Mittens with an opening to free the fingers when needed, which could be quickly closed again when the task was done. Convertible gloves, 5 centuries before the fashion industry invented the concept. For the head they wore hats, hooded cloaks, or simply wrapped cloth around head and neck. The goal was to cover everything: ears, neck, forehead, leaving as little exposed skin as possible. Some women developed a way of wrapping hair with cloth to create an extra insulating layer around the head, like a thermal turban made from scrap fabric. On the coldest workdays outdoors, they rubbed animal fat on exposed skin, face, hands, neck. The fat formed a barrier against wind and helped retain body heat. It also protected against cracking and cold injuries. The problem is, rancid animal fat has a distinctive scent, especially when mixed with sweat, wood smoke, and the general odor of a person who bathes 3 times a year on a good run. Medieval perfume was a complex olfactory experience, not necessarily a pleasant one. But perhaps the most ingenious technique was the system of heat by controlled exercise. Peasants discovered that specific movements, thumping arms against the torso, swinging legs, rubbing hands vigorously, could quickly restart circulation and generate internal heat. They developed a series of exercises that could be done discreetly while working, without looking like they were slacking off. A medieval version of aerobics disguised as productive labor. And at night, when all those layers still weren't enough, enter the era's most advanced technology: stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth. These improvised warmers were placed in the bed before sleeping, warming the space under the covers. In the small hours when the stones cooled, they at least kept a better ambient temperature than the icy air in the rest of the house. It was like having a hot water bottle, only made of rock and with a very real risk of fire if you didn't know what you were doing. The combination of all these techniques, multiple layers, natural materials, active body heating, and a big dose of stubbornness, allowed peasants to go out and work in temperatures that today would make any sensible person stay home, watching Netflix under an electric blanket. Of course, the price of this cold resistance was living constantly uncomfortable, in heavy, damp clothes that smelled in ways that would make a skunk reconsider its life choices. Now let's talk about one of the most important discoveries of medieval survival. You are what you eat. Especially when what you eat determines whether you'll be able to generate enough body heat not to turn into a human popsicle. Medieval peasants discovered, through centuries of trial and error, mostly error, that certain foods work as internal fuel for the human body. And when I say fuel, I mean literally foods that make your metabolism speed up, your circulation improve, and your body temperature rise a few precious degrees. But before we dive into medieval nutritional science, let's establish one thing. A peasant's winter diet had nothing to do with variety, culinary pleasure, or anything remotely resembling what we now call a healthy diet. It was pure, simple caloric survival. In autumn, peasant families turned into obsessive human squirrels, hoarding absolutely everything that could be preserved for the hungry months ahead. Grains, dried vegetables, smoked meat, aged cheese, nuts, dried fruit. If it had nutritional value and wouldn't rot, it was stored with the care of someone stacking gold. Because in winter, food literally mattered more than gold. Gold doesn't warm your body from the inside or keep you from starving. The base of the medieval winter diet was something called pottage, basically a thick soup made with whatever was available, all thrown into a big pot and cooked until it became a nutritious paste. Pottage was like the medieval smoothie, only hot, salty, and with chunks of things you'd rather not identify. The recipe for pottage varied depending on whatever was left in the family's stores: oats, barley, dried peas, beans, bits of dried meat, marrow bones, vegetables preserved in salt, wild herbs. It all went into the pot and cooked together until it turned into a thick, calorie-packed mass. The final result had the consistency of porridge and the taste of, well, everything mixed together. It wasn't gourmet, but it was efficient. One bowl of well-made pottage delivered carbs for quick energy, protein to maintain muscle mass, and fats for internal thermal insulation. It was the medieval protein shake, just without chocolate flavor and with way more fiber. But here's where peasants were true nutritional geniuses. They discovered that certain spices and herbs not only improved the flavor of pottage, but also raised body temperature for whoever ate it. Pepper, when they could buy or barter for it, was added generously to winter food, not because they loved spicy food, but because they knew empirically that pepper warms the body from the inside. They didn't understand capsaicin or vasodilation, but they knew that after eating peppered pottage, they felt less cold. Wild ginger, when found in the forest, was dried and kept as treasure. A pinch of dried ginger in morning pottage was like taking a natural energy drink that lasted for hours. Garlic was also used abundantly, not only to preserve other foods, but because it improved blood circulation. It was intuitive culinary pharmacy. 5 centuries before modern medicine figured out the thermogenic benefits of these foods. Meat was another crucial element of body-warming strategy. But not just any meat, fatty meat. In autumn, when animals were at peak weight before winter, peasant families slaughtered pigs, old oxen, and sheep that weren't going to survive the cold anyway. The fat from these animals was processed and stored in various ways. Some turned into lard for cooking, some preserved other foods, and some, the most valuable part, was consumed directly as a concentrated calorie source. 1 spoonful of melted lard mixed into morning pottage gave enough energy to work for hours in the cold without feeling hungry. It was like carrying an internal high-density battery. The problem was that pure lard tastes like, well, rancid animal fat. But when you're burning 4,000 calories a day just to stay warm and do basic survival work, taste becomes a secondary concern. During harsher months, some peasants even drank hot bone broth several times a day. Bones from cows, pigs, or sheep were cracked open to release marrow, then boiled for hours to make a broth rich in fat and minerals. This broth was consumed steaming, working as a medieval energy drink that warmed you on the outside and nourished you inside. It was like drinking cappuccino, only made of animal marrow and tasting like animal marrow. But perhaps the smartest nutritional discovery peasants made was meal timing. They ate differently in winter, not 3 regular meals, but small portions constantly throughout the day. The logic was simple. Digestion generates body heat. So instead of eating a lot at once and going hours without food, they kept the digestive system constantly running with small amounts of food every few hours. It was like keeping an internal furnace always lit, feeding it with small fuel portions all day long. In the morning, before going out to work, they had hot pottage with lard. Mid-morning, a piece of dry bread with fat. Lunch, more pottage, maybe with some preserved meat. Afternoon snack, nuts or dried fruit. Dinner, the heaviest meal of the day. More pottage, meat, and if lucky, some aged cheese. And before bed, 1 last bowl of hot bone broth, which helped warm the body for the freezing night ahead. The result of this constant eating regime was to keep metabolism accelerated and body temperature stable even in extreme conditions. It was medieval biohacking done by people who had no idea what metabolism was, but perfectly understood the practical effects of different eating strategies. Of course, this fat and carb-heavy diet wouldn't be recommended by any modern nutritionist. But modern nutritionists don't need to generate enough body heat to survive 20°C winters without central heating. It was a prolonged emergency diet, calibrated for one goal only: keeping you alive and functional when nature was actively trying to freeze you to death. During the hardest stretches, when food stores were running out but winter still hadn't ended, families had to get creative with alternative sources of nutrition. The inner bark of specific trees was collected, dried, and ground to mix into the pottage as a source of fiber and carbohydrates. Wild roots that went unnoticed in summer became precious ingredients. Acorns were processed, a long, labor-intensive routine of soaking, drying, and grinding repeatedly to remove the bitter tannins, and turned into a flour that could be used to thicken soups or make a kind of dense bread. It was like having a plan B, C and D for every category of food, in case plan A didn't work. And when even the alternative sources started to run out, that's when strategic fasting came in. Not religious or aesthetic fasting, but calculated fasting to stretch the remaining resources until spring arrived. Peasants discovered they could drastically reduce food intake for a few days, as long as they kept up hot liquids and small amounts of fat. It was like putting the body into power-saving mode, dialing down metabolism to make the stores last longer. Obviously, that left them weaker, more susceptible to disease, and less capable of heavy physical work. But it also kept them alive when the alternative was starving before the snow melted. It was human resource management applied at the most basic level, calculating exactly how many calories were necessary to keep vital functions going until new food sources became available. If you think counting calories in a phone app is complicated, imagine doing it in your head with human lives at stake, and with no certainty about when the next decent meal will appear. One of the most counterintuitive secrets of medieval survival is that when the killing cold was outside, standing still was the worst choice possible. Peasants discovered that the human body is a heat-generating machine, but only when in constant motion. Medieval sedentary lifestyle didn't exist, not out of aesthetic choice or fitness awareness, but because standing still for more than an hour literally meant starting to freeze from the inside out. So they turned necessity into virtue. All winter work was planned to keep the body in constant activity, generating heat through muscle movement. It was like living in a giant outdoor gym, except instead of paying a membership, you were paying with your life if you stopped moving. A peasant's day began before dawn with the most important task: rekindling the fire. But it wasn't just tossing logs onto the flames. First, you had to kneel down, blow on the embers, carefully feed them with fine twigs, then with larger wood. Constant movements that got the blood flowing and muscles gradually warmed. Then came the ritual of getting dressed, which, as we've seen, involved tying, adjusting, and relayering multiple pieces of clothing. Constant motion, active circulation, internal heat generated by simple physical effort. Breakfast also demanded movement, stirring the pottage in the pot, chopping ingredients, serving the family. No sitting around passively waiting for food to appear. Even eating kept the body working, and then the real day's labor began. In winter, peasants didn't have the option of taking a break from farming until the weather improves. Animals needed daily care. Cows wanted milking, pigs wanted feeding, chickens wanted their eggs collected, and all these creatures had the irritating habit of doing their basic needs, regardless of outside temperatures. Taking care of animals in winter meant carrying buckets of water, often having to smash through ice first, pushing manure carts, hauling hay bales, chasing runaway chickens, all in temperatures that made your fingers ache within minutes. But here's the trick. This mandatory work doubled as perfectly calibrated body warming, enough physical activity to get the heart pumping and muscles hot, but not so intense that it caused excessive sweat, because sweat in medieval cold meant death by hypothermia. After the animals came the daily hunt for firewood. And here peasants developed practical techniques of energy management through physical work. Chopping wood was divided into specific stages. First, walking to the cutting area, constant motion to stay warm on the way. Second, the cutting itself. Axe raised, axe down, repeated dozens of times. Third, and smarter, chopping in intense bursts of 15 to 20 minutes, followed by breaks to reorganize the already cut wood. During these pauses, they did lighter but steady movements, stacking, tying, adjusting, that kept circulation active without letting the body cool down. Carrying the wood back home required another kind of care. Loads small enough not to exhaust, but heavy enough to maintain constant muscle effort, and always at a fast pace. Not running, which would cause sweat, but brisk walking that kept the heart pumping hot blood to the extremities. On the coldest days, when working outdoors became dangerous, they shifted activities indoors, but still kept the body moving. Repairing tools, mending clothes, preparing food, cleaning the house, everything became an excuse not to stay still. Women spent hours spinning wool or weaving, repetitive movements that kept arms and fingers functioning. Men worked with wood, making small repairs or crafting simple tools. But perhaps the most practical technique was what they did when someone showed the first signs of dangerous chilling. Specific movements that could be done quickly. Slapping arms against the body vigorously, doing fast squats, swinging legs alternately, rubbing hands hard. They also discovered that working in groups was more efficient than working alone. Not only for getting the job done, but for shared heat. 3 people chopping wood together generated more ambient warmth than 1 person working solo. During storms or extreme cold, when even stepping outside was suicide, entire families organized indoor activities to keep everyone moving. Reorganizing food stores, cleaning and sharpening tools, counting and recounting stored grains. It wasn't productivity for productivity's sake. It was movement for survival. Children had their own responsibilities calibrated to generate body heat, collecting eggs from the henhouse, feeding small animals, helping carry firewood in tiny amounts. Real work, but adapted for smaller bodies that lost heat faster. At night, when outdoor work stopped, they had specific routines to keep the body warm until sleep. Light exercises by the fire, hand and foot massages, stretches that preserved muscle flexibility even in the cold. And in bed, even sleeping required strategy. They positioned themselves in a specific way. Larger bodies on the edges to protect the smaller ones, everyone clustered together to share body heat. During the night, whoever got up to feed the fire did quick warming movements before diving back under the blankets. The most experienced peasants developed an almost supernatural instinct for detecting the first signs of dangerous chilling, numb fingers, involuntary shivering, excessive drowsiness, and reacted immediately with specific movements to reverse the process. They knew exactly how many squats were needed to reactivate circulation in the legs, how many arm swings to warm up the hands, how long a brisk walk took to raise overall body temperature. In the harshest months, some communities developed shift systems, groups taking turns at outdoor tasks, ensuring no one stayed exposed to the cold for too long. But also that essential work continued. The result of all this constant activity? Medieval peasants who, despite living in conditions we'd now consider extreme, maintained impressive physical strength, flexibility, and cardiovascular endurance, not out of aesthetic choice, but because unfit people simply didn't survive winter. Only the physically capable made it alive to spring. Of course, this lifestyle took its toll. Repetitive strain injuries, early arthritis, accelerated physical wear. But for medieval peasants, those were future problems. The immediate problem was surviving the next 3 months without turning into an ice sculpture in their own yard. Among all the bizarre medieval survival techniques, perhaps the most fascinating and embarrassing was realizing that stacked humans are warmer than scattered humans. Medieval peasants practically invented the concept of collaborative heat 5 centuries before any self-help guru discovered the benefits of teamwork. Privacy. What a modern, unnecessary concept. During the deadliest winter months, entire families organized into thermal formations that would make an emperor penguin feel right at home. The basic strategy was simple. The more human bodies crammed into a small space, the higher the ambient temperature. Body math. 5 people in a 16 square meter hut. Watch natural heating. 1 person alone in a 16 square meter hut. Shocker funeral in March. But here's where it got interesting. It wasn't just piling people together and hoping for the best. Peasants developed a whole science of human thermal optimization that would make an HVAC engineer cry with emotion. First, heating hierarchy. The smallest children always stayed in the middle. They lost heat fastest and needed the most protection. Young, healthy adults stayed at the edges, functioning as human thermal shields. Elders stayed in an intermediate position, protected but not smothered. Second, strategic rotation. During the night, people took turns between the coldest positions, edges, and warmest positions, center. It was like a shift system, except instead of working, you were rotating to not die frozen. Medieval democracy. Everyone gets the right not to turn into a popsicle. Third, and most ingenious, they discovered that different body types generated different amounts of heat. Big muscular men worked like natural human furnaces. Women, especially breastfeeding ones, had sped-up metabolism that produced extra warmth. Children were like high-speed portable heaters, burning energy fast and needing constant refueling. So they strategically distributed these heat generators across the group to maximize thermal efficiency. It was human resource management applied to thermodynamics, practiced by people who thought thermodynamics was a weird curse word. But the most, let's say, intimate aspect of this collective survival was bed sharing. And when I say bed sharing, I mean entire families literally stacked in one single bed. If we can even call a pile of straw covered with cloth a bed. Picture this: you, your spouse, your kids, your parents, your in-laws, and occasionally the neighbor whose roof collapsed in a storm, all crammed into the space of a modern double bed. Comfort? Where are you when we need you? Sleeping position followed strict rules. Small children in the middle, always. Adults on the edges, everyone on their side facing the same direction, like human sardines in a giant tin can. When someone wanted to turn over, everyone had to turn together. It was mandatory nightly choreography. If someone snored too loudly, it wasn't just a manners problem, it was a matter of collective survival. Because if you woke others up, they got irritated. And irritated people generated less body heat. And less body heat meant everyone got colder. Domestic harmony, literally a matter of life or death. On the most brutal days, when even going out for firewood was thermal suicide, entire communities gathered in a single house, usually the largest or best built in the village. 20, 30 people piled into a space that normally housed one family. It was like a medieval music festival, except instead of music, everyone was trying not to freeze to death. These emergency thermal gatherings had their own social rules. Each family contributed what they had: firewood, food, blankets, and mainly warm bodies. It was medieval shared economy. You offer your body heat, I offer my reserve of pork lard. Collective activities during these meetings were carefully planned to maximize group heat generation. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was vocal exercise that kept facial muscles active and generated warmth through movement. Group singing had the same effect, only multiplied. Simple games involving hand and arm movement were encouraged. Not competitive games that could cause stress. Stress reduced thermal efficiency. But collaborative activities that kept everyone slightly active, without causing sweat. It was group therapy disguised as heating. Strategy. Women organized in circles to spin wool or mend. Clothes. Manual work that kept fingers and arms constantly moving, while also producing useful survival items. Men maintained small tools or worked on carpentry projects that could be done indoors. And children? They had the most important responsibility of all: being cute and generating heat through constant activity. They ran, in a controlled way, indoors, played games involving hand movement, and served as portable heaters adults could hug when needed. Medieval child labor, warming adults through bodily cuteness. But the smartest aspect of these collective meetings was the heat bank system. During the day, when there was sunlight or when going outside was possible, some adults went out to fetch firewood or do urgent tasks. When they returned frozen from exposure, they were immediately absorbed into the group and warmed through collective heat. It was like having a recovery spa, only made of dirty human bodies smelling of goat. Social status during these gatherings wasn't determined by wealth or rank, but by thermal efficiency. The guy who generated the most body heat automatically became the center of attention. Literally, everyone wanted to be near him. Medieval social success, being an efficient human radiator, families with particularly warm members, people with fast metabolism, pregnant women, muscular men, automatically became popular in winter. It was like being a celebrity, only your fame came from your ability to heat others. Oh, that's John. He's as warm as a fireplace and snores lightly. excellent to sleep next to. When food began to run low, these collective gatherings also worked as a distribution system. Families with more stores shared with families with less, not out of altruism, but practical necessity. Hungry people generate less body heat. Thermal communism, from each according to their ability to heat, to each according to their need not to become a popsicle. The most organized communities developed rotation systems. Different houses hosted the collective gathering on different days, spreading the wear of resources and ensuring everyone had access to group heating. It was mandatory hospitality. Your turn to host 30 dirty people in your tiny house. During particularly violent storms, when the cutting wind made it impossible to hold heat, even animals were brought inside the collective gatherings. Cows, goats, pigs, anything that breathed and generated body heat was welcome. The result? Social meetings that were a mix of community center, emergency shelter, improvised zoo, and olfactory experience testing the limits of human endurance. But it worked. During the harshest winters, entire communities survived thanks to this forced thermal cooperation. Mortality rates dropped drastically compared to families that tried to survive alone. Survival through human piling. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't comfortable, but it was definitely effective. And when spring finally came, everyone went back to their individual houses, promising never to talk again about how many times they had to share a blanket with the father-in-law who had digestive problems. Some medieval survival traumas were better forgotten quickly. Now we get to the most, let's say, creative aspect of medieval survival. What to do when someone in the family started showing dangerous signs of extreme cold. Medieval peasants developed an arsenal of medical techniques that would make any modern paramedic question their sanity, and possibly work anyway. Medieval hypothermia medicine. 50% empirical science, 50% desperation, 100% improvisation with whatever was on hand. The first signs of dangerous cooling were known to any experienced adult. Toes going numb, uncontrollable shivering, mental confusion, overwhelming drowsiness. When someone started showing these symptoms, the whole family went into thermal emergency mode. The first treatment, and the most obvious, was direct body heating. The person affected was literally wrapped by other family members, offering their body heat through direct physical contact. There was no shame or modesty. When someone was dying of cold, modesty was a secondary issue. Picture a therapeutic human sandwich. Frozen person in the middle, warm people on the sides, everyone hugging until body temperature normalized. But here's where medieval creativity shined. They discovered certain body parts transferred heat better than others. Chest to chest worked better than anything else. Warm hands in the armpits quickly reactivated circulation. Frozen feet were placed on someone's belly or back, spots that concentrated body heat. Human. Thermal mapping done by people who'd never heard of medicine but perfectly understood where the human body stored and released heat. When direct body heating wasn't enough, medieval hydrotherapy came into play, which basically meant throw hot water on the person until they stopped shivering. But not just any hot water dumped any old way. The technique was specific. Start with warm water on feet and hands, gradually raising the temperature as the body responded. Too hot water all at once could cause thermal shock, something they knew empirically, even without understanding the physiology behind it. They heated water in pots over the fire and used thick cloths to apply hot compresses to the person's extremities, wrists, ankles, neck, places where arteries ran close to the surface and where heat could be absorbed efficiently by blood circulation. Medieval thermal acupuncture, finding the right spots to warm the body from the inside out. But maybe the most ingenious technique was the improvised sauna. In extreme emergencies, they created hot steam environments inside the house. They took large stones, heated them in the fire until red hot, and then, very carefully, poured water over them to create instant steam. The frozen person was positioned close enough to receive the steam, but far enough not to get burned. Think of it as a medieval version of a Turkish bath, only made with backyard rocks and family desperation. The hot steam not only warmed the body outside, but was also inhaled, heating the internal respiratory system. They discovered that breathing hot air helped raise body temperature faster than just external heating. For more severe cases, there was the forced thermal bed technique. The frozen person was placed in a preheated bed, using hot stones wrapped in cloths, embers covered with ashes, or even other family members who'd warmed the bed with their own bodies first. Then, they were literally buried under every warm fabric available. Cloaks, blankets, extra clothes, animal skins, anything that could trap heat. The goal was to create a thermal cocoon that forced the body to reheat using its own energy, without letting the warmth escape. Medieval intensive care, turning someone into a warm fabric mummy until they stopped dying of cold. But what if external methods didn't work? That's when internal medicine came in. Treatments that heated the body from the inside out through forced feeding. Boiling bone broth was the first line of defense. Not only did it provide calories, but the hot liquid, once ingested, directly raised the body's internal temperature. They forced the cold person to sip small, constant amounts, even if semi-conscious. For extreme cases, there was what we'd call today a medicinal fat shot. Melted pork lard, mixed with honey, when available, and spices like pepper or ginger, was given in small doses. The fat provided concentrated calories to speed metabolism, while spices stimulated blood circulation. Medieval energy drink. If the flavor didn't kill you, at least it kept you alive. They also discovered the therapeutic power of alcohol, not to get someone drunk, but to force vasodilation and improve circulation. Small doses of warmed wine or strong beer were administered carefully, just enough to stimulate blood flow, not enough to cause more heat loss. Emergency alcohol dosing. The line between medicine and poison was in the quantity and timing. In desperate situations, when nothing else worked, they resorted to what we might call controlled thermal shock. The frozen person was quickly moved between hot and cold environments strategically, from the freezing outdoors to near the fire, then pulled away when sweating started, then brought back close again. The goal was to force the circulatory system to react and re-engage natural body temperature control. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't gentle, but sometimes it worked when gentler methods failed. Medieval thermal resuscitation. If gentle treatment doesn't work, traumatize the body until it functions again. To prevent relapses, they kept the person warm under constant watch for days after initial recovery. Someone in the family always slept nearby, monitoring body temperature by touch. Hot food was offered every few hours. Light physical activity was encouraged as soon as the person could move. Domestic intensive care. When the nearest hospital was 3 centuries away, you improvised with what you had. Children received specialized treatments since they lost body heat faster than adults. They were often placed directly against the bare chest of a mother or older sister. Skin-to-skin contact, transferring heat more efficiently than any fabric. For babies at critical risk, there was the abdominal warming technique. The child was placed on an adult's belly, under clothing, where they were heated by body warmth and shielded from the environment. Medieval incubator. When the most advanced technology available was someone's belly, elders posed specific challenges because they had slower circulation and less muscle mass to generate heat. For them, warming had to be more gradual and constant. Hot compresses were applied for longer periods, always checking the skin to avoid burns. Gentle massages with warm animal fat were used to stimulate circulation in extremities, not relaxing massage. Therapeutic massage meant to force blood into fingers and feet that had lost feeling. Medieval geriatric physiotherapy. When your most sophisticated medical equipment was your own hands and practical intuition. But not all treatments worked. Medieval peasants also knew how to recognize when someone was beyond help. Black toes, prolonged unconsciousness, extremely weak breathing, signs the freezing had gone too far. In those cases, the focus shifted from treatment to palliative care. keeping the person comfortable and warm until the end, surrounded by family. No hope of cure, but dignity and care. Medieval terminal care. When you can't save someone, at least you make sure they don't die alone and cold. Medical knowledge for thermal emergencies was passed down generation to generation through practical experience. Mothers taught daughters, fathers taught sons. No textbooks or formal courses, just centuries of trial, error, and careful observation of what worked and what killed. Each family had its own variations of these techniques, adapted to local conditions and resources. Families near hot springs used naturally heated water. Families in regions with certain medicinal plants incorporated specific herbs into treatments. Medieval personalized medicine, each family developing its own emergency protocol based on what they had and what actually worked. Let's talk about one of the most ingenious and potentially smelly medieval survival strategies. Using domestic animals as mobile biological furnaces, peasants discovered that large animals generate constant heat, eat less than humans in winter, and have the added bonus of producing milk, eggs, and eventually meat. Animal multitasking, heating, food, and company, all in one furry package that occasionally poops in the wrong place. The cow was the absolute MVP of medieval domestic heating. An adult cow generates about the same heat as a person doing moderate physical exercise, except she does it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without complaining about the cold or asking for extra blankets. During the harshest months, cows were literally brought inside the house, not in a separate division, not in a heated annex, inside the same house where the family slept. The practical result? Indoor temperature rose several degrees just from the presence of a 900-pound mammal breathing and metabolizing. Picture sharing your living room with a cow named Brunhilde who snores, chews non-stop, and has very strong opinions about where to relieve herself. But here's the genius trick. Cows weren't just tolerated inside, they were strategically positioned. Peasants discovered that putting a cow at one end of the house created a hot zone that radiated warmth through the room. The animal's big body worked like a living radiator that never needed refueling. Medieval thermal zoning. Instead of air ducts, you had Brunhilde breathing heavily in the corner. Pigs were another essential part of the domestic heating system. Smaller than cows, but with a specific thermal advantage. They generated lots of body heat relative to size and loved to pile up. A group of pigs sleeping together created a concentrated heat zone the family could take advantage of. The most common technique was building the pig sleeping area adjacent to the human sleeping area, separated only by a thin mud wall. Animal heat passed through the wall, warming the human side without the full problems of odor and mess that came with sharing space directly. Pig proximity heating. All the thermal benefits of pigs, with 50% less barnyard smell. Goats were an interesting compromise. Smaller than cows, cleaner than pigs, and with the bonus of being excellent climbers. During snowstorms, when other animals got stuck outside, goats could enter and leave through small openings. They also had a peculiar thermal feature. Goats generated heat very efficiently but were small enough to literally sleep with humans without crushing anyone. Desperate families sometimes let young goats sleep in the same bed as children. Living blanket with horns. When your only heating option at night was a teenage goat named Gertrude, chickens were used in a completely different way. Too small to generate significant ambient heat, but perfect as portable personal heaters. On extremely cold days, children carried chickens inside their clothes. The bird's body warmth heating the child's chest and belly. Picture a medieval hot water bottle, only feathered, with a beak, and occasionally laying eggs. But there were specific techniques to maximize chicken thermal potential. They were placed in shallow baskets lined with straw and positioned near people's feet during meals or sedentary activities. The bird's heat kept feet warm while the chickens stayed protected from the extreme cold. At night, chicken baskets were sometimes placed at the bottom of the family bed, working as organic foot warmers. Heat rose through the blankets, creating a more comfortable temperature for everyone. Avian thermostat. Adjust your bed temperature by adding or removing chickens as needed. Dogs had a special role in domestic heating. Smaller than cattle but bigger than chickens, they offered directed warmth and mobile thermal support. A dog could be trained to lie in specific spots, at the feet of sick children, beside elders with circulation problems, or blocking cold drafts, custom canine heating. Your dog wasn't just a companion, it was thermal medical equipment. But the most sophisticated strategy was animal rotation. During the night, different animals were brought inside at specific times, creating waves of heating that lasted till dawn. First half of the night, pigs near the human sleeping area. Second half, cows brought closer to the house. Dawn, chickens strategically distributed for targeted warming. Morning, dogs released for mobile thermal circulation. Animal heating schedule, how to run an organic HVAC system with perfect timing. Of course, all this animal intimacy created significant practical problems. Constant manure smell, fur everywhere, nighttime noises, and the delicate issue of what to do when a 900-pound animal decided to relieve itself indoors during a snowstorm. Peasants developed emergency waste management techniques. Thick straw on the floor absorbed liquids. Solid manure was immediately removed and dumped in a designated area away from sleeping zones. And the whole cleaning operation had to be quick to avoid losing heat by opening doors unnecessarily. Thermal sanitation, cleaning up animal poop as fast as possible without letting cold in. For bigger animals, there were specific containment techniques. Cows were tied in positions limiting where they could move, but still letting them lie down and stand up. Strategically placed ropes kept the animal from walking into the human sleeping area, but didn't interfere with its ability to generate ambient heat. Animal containment engineering, how to keep a cow indoors without her destroying everything or stepping on someone. Some experienced peasants developed indoor thermal pens, walled-off areas inside the house where animals could be contained but still contribute warmth. Low stone or wooden barriers separated animal zones from human zones, letting heat through but keeping manure and random movement out. During long storms, when animals stayed indoors for days, families had to manage resources carefully. Animal feed was rationed, sleeping space reorganized for both humans and animals, and everyone developed an impressive tolerance for odors that in any other context would be unbearable. Forced interspecies cohabitation, when survival depended on accepting that you'd spend a week sleeping 3 meters away from a farting cow. Children were often assigned to care for smaller animals inside, not just as a domestic responsibility, but as a way to keep them warm through constant contact with creatures that generated heat. A child hugging a young goat got targeted heating, while the goat got protection from extreme cold. Thermal child care, when your babysitter was a goat, and your playground was the living room pen. For families with horses, there was the specific challenge of animals too big to bring easily inside, but too valuable to leave freezing outside. The solution was building annexes connected to the main house, structures that shared walls so heat passed through, keeping horses in appropriate spaces for their size. The horse's body heat warmed the shared wall, which in turn radiated warmth into the human interior. Not as efficient as having the animal inside, but more practical than shoving 1,000 to 100 pounds of horse through the front door. Indirect equine heating, all the thermal benefits of a horse without having to explain to visitors why there's a Clydesdale in the kitchen. In extreme emergencies, when family survival depended on conserving every possible degree of heat, some peasants resorted to total thermal stacking. Humans and animals were organized in a single heating formation. Large animals as the base, humans grouped around and over them, smaller animals filling empty spaces. The result was a living pile of assorted mammals, all contributing body heat to a collective thermal mass that kept everyone alive through the worst winter nights. Desperate heating solution. When your survival strategy looked like a medieval version of Jenga, only made of warm bodies and barn smells. Obviously, this forced intimacy between humans and animals had sanitary consequences. Medieval peasants didn't fully understand. cross-species diseases, parasites, respiratory problems caused by fur and organic particles in the air. But for them, those were future concerns. The immediate concern was not freezing to death before dawn. And if that meant sharing a bed with a goat that snored and occasionally spat, well, at least everyone woke up alive to complain about the smell. Nobody talks about the most brutal aspect of medieval survival. What happens to the human mind when you spend 4 straight months cold, hungry, constantly uncomfortable, and with the very real possibility that you might not live to see spring? Medieval peasants had to deal not only with the physical challenges of winter, but also with what we'd now call extreme seasonal depression. Medieval therapy, when your psychologist was the absolute need to keep functioning or die. The first psychological enemy of medieval winter was deadly boredom. Picture being trapped in a tiny house with the same people, doing the same repetitive activities for months on end. No books to read, no passive entertainment, no digital escape. Just you, your slightly smelly family, and an infinite stretch of empty time between survival tasks. Medieval boredom wasn't just annoying, it was psychologically destructive. Idle minds started creating problems where none existed, imagining unnecessary dangers, or simply spiraling into depression that made physical survival even harder. So peasants developed specific strategies of forced mental occupation. Not entertainment, occupation. Activities that kept the mind functioning and focused on practical goals, even when the body was relatively inactive. Storytelling was the most universal technique, but not just any storytelling. There was a specific art to medieval survival narratives. Stories had to be long enough to fill significant time, interesting enough to hold attention, but not so exciting that they caused unnecessary agitation. Therapeutic narrative, when your only Netflix was Uncle Jeffrey's imagination and his dubious memories of youthful adventures. Women developed storytelling traditions serving multiple psychological purposes. Tales of past springs helped maintain hope. Stories of families surviving even harsher winters provided perspective. Narratives of people making bad decisions and dying worked as subtle reminders that following survival rules was a matter of life and death. Psychotherapy, through folklore. When education, motivation, and mental health all came wrapped in a story about a witch who ate disobedient children. Men had their own versions, hunting tales, revisiting work techniques, discussing strategies for the next harvest. Not just conversation, it was knowledge maintenance and mental preparation for the future. But there were unwritten rules about what kind of story could be told in winter. Nothing too scary that might give children nightmares when they were already stressed. Nothing too nostalgic that dragged adults into depression. Nothing too optimistic that created false expectations about when winter would end. Emotional curatorship, when picking the wrong story could psychologically destabilize an entire family for weeks. Another crucial strategy was maintaining strict routines. Even when there wasn't much outdoor work to do, families created artificial schedules that divided the day into manageable segments. Wake up at the same time, eat at the same times, do specific activities at set moments. These routines weren't just organizational, they were psychologically essential. They gave structure to days that otherwise would blur into an endless smear of cold and discomfort. They created a sense of progress and control in a situation where very little was actually under human control. Medieval chronotherapy, when pretending you had control over something, was the difference between sanity and mental collapse. The most psychologically challenging part was dealing with death. In especially brutal winters, it was statistically likely that someone in the community, small children, frail elders, people with pre-existing health issues, wouldn't survive until spring. Peasants had to find ways to process grief and loss while still fighting for their own survival. Mourning rituals had to be practical, quick burials when possible, or temporary preservation of the body until the ground thawed enough to dig a grave. Psychological brutality, grieving in 10 minutes, because if you spent more time, the living might die too. Yet even in this harshness, communities developed psychological resilience techniques we'd now consider advanced. Music was one of them. Singing wasn't just to pass the time. It was emotional regulation, maintaining group spirit, synchronizing breathing, and reducing anxiety. Lullabies weren't just for children. They were for adults too, sung softly at night to calm minds and create the illusion of safety amid the howling wind outside. Collective prayer was another powerful tool. Regardless of the specific faith, prayer worked as a way to create meaning in suffering, strengthen hope, and connect individuals to something bigger than themselves. It wasn't theology, it was practical psychology disguised as religion and humor. Yes, humor was a fundamental survival strategy. Making jokes about frozen toes, exaggerating stories about clumsy accidents, finding comic relief in daily miseries. Humor was a pressure valve that kept despair from taking over completely. Medieval stand-up comedy, performed by the guy who just slipped on ice carrying manure and decided to turn his humiliation into entertainment for everyone. In the end, the psychology of medieval winter survival was based on three pillars: structured routine, collective narrative, and humor in the face of misery. Not exactly a modern therapy program, but effective enough to keep people sane while waiting for the snow to melt and life to return to something resembling normal. And then, after 4 endless months of cold, hunger, and improvisation, came the moment everyone dreamed of: spring. But don't imagine a Hollywood scene of birds chirping, flowers blooming, and everyone running happily through green fields. Medieval spring was the apocalypse's end credits. Relief mixed with new nightmares. The first sign was the snow melting, rivers of dirty water cutting through villages, mud swallowing everything, and the sudden reappearance of things hidden under snow for months, including the bodies of animals, and sometimes people, who hadn't survived the winter. Spring smell, a mix of mud, manure, and rotting surprises. At first, the thaw was celebrated. Finally, the chance to breathe without feeling like the air was stabbing your lungs. Finally, freedom to move without risking turning into an icicle. Finally, the possibility of varied food, since early plants started sprouting. But relief quickly turned into new challenges. Flooding was constant. Rivers swollen with melted snow invaded fields and houses. Mudslides destroyed storage pits and carried away what little food had survived. Structures weakened by winter collapsed when the ground softened. Spring cleaning wasn't about sweeping floors. It was about rebuilding half the house and digging your belongings out of 2 feet of mud. On the food front, the problem wasn't solved immediately. Yes, there were early sprouts, nettles, wild garlic, dandelions, but those weren't enough to feed a family. It took weeks, sometimes months, before crops were ready for harvest. The food shortage extended well into spring. So families entered the spring hunger period, paradoxically one of the hardest times of year, when food stores were gone. But new food wasn't yet available. Many who had survived the winter succumbed in spring, weakened and unable to endure the final starvation stretch. Spring wasn't salvation. It was the final boss in the survival game. But nature also brought rewards. With the thaw, fishing became possible again, providing fresh protein. Animals gave birth, increasing milk and meat supply. Wild plants multiplied rapidly, offering new dietary options. And the psychological relief of seeing the world green again, after months of nothing but white and gray, was indescribable. It was like waking from a nightmare and discovering color still existed. Communities celebrated with rituals marking the end of winter, collective meals with what was available, symbolic ceremonies thanking survival, and the rebirth of social life that had been hibernating for months. Children ran outdoors again. Animals grazed freely, and adults, despite exhaustion, started repairing houses, fences, and fields. It wasn't rest. It was frenetic work, but work done under the sun, not under the threat of freezing to death. Medieval spring was a mix of relief, trauma, and renewed struggle. A reminder that survival wasn't a final destination, but a continuous cycle of preparation, endurance, and adaptation. For medieval peasants, every survived winter wasn't just another year of life. It was proof of their resilience, creativity, and collective stubbornness in facing a nature that seemed determined to test human limits. And maybe that's the most fascinating lesson from this whole story. Medieval peasants didn't survive because they had the best resources, the best science, or the best technology. They survived because they refused to die, turning every scrap of material, every bit of knowledge, every drop of community into a weapon against the cold. The next time you complain because your heater broke for 2 hours, remember, your ancestors survived 4 months with nothing but smoke, manure, and the warmth of a goat named Brunhilde.